When will China overtake America? Depending on who you ask, it's either already happening or it's just around the corner. But there's one problem trapping China, stopping it from becoming a superpower like America. It's not its economy or technology or even its government. It is geography. Put America and China side by side and the difference hits you immediately. America touches three separate bodies of water: the Atlantic on one side, the Pacific on the other, and the Gulf of Mexico down south. American ships can leave port and reach basically anywhere in the world, and no one can block all three exit routes at once. Now, why does that matter? Because being a superpower isn't just about being the largest or the richest. It's about being able to influence anywhere on Earth, while nobody can really stop you from doing so. As America, you can move your military to the other side of the world just like that. You can protect trade routes in the Middle East while watching the Pacific at the same time. That only works if you have ocean access in multiple directions and no one's blocking you. Without that, you can still be powerful, you can still be wealthy, but you can't push that power across the globe. You're stuck defending your own neighborhood. And that's the problem China can't solve. China only touches one ocean, the Pacific. And between its coast and open water, there's something America doesn't have. A long chain of islands running from Japan in the north, past Taiwan, through the Philippines, all the way down to Indonesia in the south. It runs almost the entire length of China's coastline. It's like a fence between China's yard and the open street. And almost every country sitting on that fence either has a tense relationship with China or they host American military troops, or both. When things are calm, it's alright. Trade is flowing and Chinese ships can still pass through these gaps. But if a serious conflict ever breaks out, those gaps will close. And China's biggest weak point sits right inside one of them. This narrow strip of water between Malaysia and Indonesia is called the Malacca Strait. About 80% of China's oil passes through here. Think about what that means. Almost everything that keeps China's economy running, the fuel for factories, for power grids, for transport, flows through one narrow corridor that China doesn't control. As long as everyone's friendly, it's fine. The moment that changes, China's sitting in the dark. That's not the position of a country projecting global power. That's the position of a country protecting a lifeline. And it's China's energy situation right now. You're not able to play offense because you're preoccupied with just trying to keep the lights on. So China's been trying to build a way around this issue. And honestly, the idea makes sense. If the ocean is risky, build another route. Instead of relying only on the Pacific, send pipelines, highway, and rail lines west. Through Central Asia, through Pakistan to the Arabian Sea, through Myanmar to the Indian Ocean. Backdoors that bypass those ocean choke points entirely. We're talking tens of billions of dollars, years of construction, and on paper, it could change everything. If it worked perfectly, China could move oil and goods without depending so heavily on those ocean choke points. But look at what these routes actually involve. Some of them cut through brutal mountain terrain, like the China-Pakistan corridor running across the Karakoram range, where it's high elevation with the risk of landslides and harsh weather. And it's not just geography. Other routes pass through countries with unstable political situations, like Myanmar, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so on, where the government in charge this year might not be in charge the next, where the pipeline you build today could be a target tomorrow. And even if every rail line and highway could run perfectly, there's still the problem of scale. One large cargo ship carries roughly what 1,000 trucks move. Sea shipping handles volumes that land routes simply can't match at the same cost. You could run trains and trucks across those mountain passes day and night. You still wouldn't move in a year what a busy shipping lane handles in a week. The ocean isn't just convenient, it's efficient at a scale that land routes can't replace. And China's main access to it is fenced in by other countries. Meanwhile, America never had to build a back door. It was born with three open ones. Now you might be thinking, okay, so trade is harder for China. That's not the end of the world, right? And if the ocean problem was the only issue, you would have a point. But it's not. Because China can't fully feed itself, and that makes everything we just talked about even more serious. America has the Mississippi River Basin. It's the largest connected river system in the world. It links deep inland farmland straight to the Gulf of Mexico. I cannot overstate how powerful this is. This means American farmers can grow huge amounts of food, then ship it cheaply, at scale, downriver to global markets. That's why America is one of the world's largest exporters of staple crops like corn, soybeans, and wheat. It grows more than it needs. And when you control food like that, other countries depend on you, not the other way around. China's situation is the opposite. It has about 20% of the world's population, but only around 7% of the world's farmland. That's a tight ratio. You can make it work. China has made it work for decades, but there's zero room for anything to go wrong. And right now, things are going wrong. Northern China is where a huge chunk of the country's wheat and corn comes from. It's a breadbasket, and it's running out of water. The underground reserves farmers have been pumping for decades are dropping. Wells that used to work now have to go deeper. Some have dried up completely. And then there's the Yellow River. For thousands of years, this river was the lifeline of Chinese civilization. Entire dynasties rose along its banks. But today, the Yellow River sometimes doesn't even make it to the sea. It dries up before it gets there. China's response has been to undertake one of the most ambitious engineering projects in history. It's called the South to North Water Diversion Project. Hundreds of miles of canals built to physically move water from the wetter south up to the drier north. Artificial rivers with pumping stations, aqueducts, and tunnels that cut through mountains. It's seriously impressive. But again, they're fighting against nature rather than just relying on it. But here's where it gets really uncomfortable for China, because all of these problems connect to each other. China can't grow enough food, so imports huge amounts from overseas. Soybeans, grains, meat, cooking oil, and most of those shipments sail through the same waters we just talked about, past the same chain of islands, through the same narrow straits. The whole point of being a superpower is that nobody can hold you hostage. America doesn't need to worry about food because it grows more than it needs, at least in staple foods. China, on the other hand, doesn't have that luxury. Instead, it has a leash tied to the waters from where the food arrives. A country in that position has to prioritize keeping trade flowing above almost everything else. That shapes how it behaves, it limits how far it can push. For a country that wants to project power across the globe, that's a serious constraint. Now, China's answer to all of its geographical problems has been the same every time. If nature didn't give it to you, build it. Throw money at it, throw people at it, and for decades, that worked. China built more stuff in the last 30 years than most countries have in their entire history. But all of that needs one thing: people. Workers to build it, workers to run it, taxpayers to pay for it. And this is where China hits a wall that no amount of engineering can get past. This is a different type of geography problem. Human geography. China's population started shrinking in 2022. From 1980 to 2015, the government ran what's called the one-child policy, where most families could only have one child. At the time, China was dirt poor, so the policy was supposed to prevent famine and slow down population growth so that there were less mouths to feed, and it worked. But it worked so well they left a hole in the population that can never be filled. Those missing people were supposed to be today's factory workers, today's taxpayers, the ones supporting the elderly. Instead, by around 2035, China is projected to have over 400 million people above the age of 60. That's more than the entire population of the US. Except, instead of working and producing, they will need pensions, healthcare, and support. And the generation that was supposed to carry that burden was never born. When Japan faced aging like this, it was already one of the richest countries in the world. China is dealing with it while the average income is still far lower. Imagine supporting a group the size of America's population but with only a fraction of America's wealth. That's the harsh mathematics that they cannot engineer their way out of. You can build a canal, artificial islands and railways, but you can't build a 25-year-old. Even if families suddenly started having more children tomorrow, those kids wouldn't enter the workforce for 20 years. The population numbers for the next few decades are already set in stone. China knows this. That's part of why there's such a huge push into automation, robotics, and AI. The idea is to replace missing workers with machines, and maybe that softens the blow. But no country has ever automated its way through a population decline while still trying to rise economically. Now at this point, it'd be easy to just say China's screwed and just leave it there. But that's lazy, and honestly, it'd be wrong. What China's done over the past 40 years is insane. 800 million people pulled out of poverty, cities built from scratch, a manufacturing base that produces almost a third of what the world buys. You can't just wave that away. And here's something that gets lost in the whole China versus America debate. China's own leaders don't actually frame their goal as replacing America. Xi Jinping constantly talks about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. That idea goes back a few hundred years. The belief is that China used to sit at the center of civilization, then spent about a century getting pushed around by Western powers and Japan, and now is climbing back to where it thinks it belongs. And that's not just political messaging, it runs deeper than that. For thousands of years, China was a civilization that built walls from the outside world. The Great Wall wasn't built to invade the rest of the world. It was built to keep threats out. For most of its history, China didn't try to conquer distant continents. It focused on securing its core territories and keeping chaos away from its borders. That instinct never really went away. Even today, you have the Great Firewall that blocks Western platforms like Google, Facebook, and YouTube. It may be a different tool, but born from the same defensive mindset. Even Deng Xiaoping, the leader who opened China to the global markets in the 1980s and 90s, said it clearly at the United Nations. He said that China would not seek superpower status in the sense of dominating other nations. He defined a superpower as a country that forces others under its control. And he said that wasn't China's path. Whether you agree that's China today or not, let's just look at what China actually does with its military. You have artificial islands in the South China Sea, constant pressure on Taiwan, building up its navy along its coastline. It's almost entirely focused on locking down its immediate neighborhood, trying to find ways around this chain of islands dominated by US allies. From the outside, China's actions can look aggressive, but structurally and mentally, it's a defensive posture. Yes, you can argue that taking Taiwan is playing offense, but to China's leaders, taking Taiwan is just taking back something that they believe belong to them. This all lines up with what geography tells us. China's position pushes it toward dominating its region, not projecting power across the entire planet. On those terms, China is already incredibly strong, the largest economic force in Asia, a genuine leader in manufacturing, electric vehicles, solar energy, high-speed rail, and more. In many parts of the tech race, it's already ahead. But the question in this video isn't whether China will be powerful, it already is. The question is whether it can do what a superpower like America does. Project power everywhere at all times with nobody able to shut the door on it. And when you step back and look at everything we covered, the geography, the demographic decline, even a long tradition of securing the core rather than expanding outwards, it all points the same way. As America declines, the most likely future isn't China just outright replacing America as a globe-spanning superpower. It's probably more of a multipolar world, where China continues being the dominant force in Asia, economically, politically, militarily. At the same time, it can build real influence in Africa, Latin America, Europe through trade, investment, and technology. But influence isn't the same as dominance. Projecting raw power everywhere at any time like America at its peak, that's what a superpower does. And the land draws the line on who gets to do that. It decided for Rome, it decided for Britain, it decided for America. And it's deciding for China right now. But one area that China is primed to take the lead in is the technology race. Check out this video to learn how that's playing out.